Podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and today is all about North Carolina. Once again, episode 206, we did some stories from North Carolina history, and we're doing 4 more today. Again, this is the home state of the pod, born and raised here. I think it's pretty great. I think it is a pretty okay, above average state. Not necessarily when it comes to education or progressive thinking, but natural resource, landscape, amazing. Culinarily, fantastic. Contributions to culture, and so that we've apparently, I think, who is it? It's either George Strait or Randy Travis is from here. I don't know. Luke Combs is apparently a big deal. Eric Church used to be a big deal. Some other country singers, who else? I was going to say Hootie, but Hootie's from South Carolina and we don't, no. But with home of Hanes, like the underwear, and Krispy Kreme and Texas Pete, ironically. Also Bojangles and Cookout and Cheerwine. So many great things. Sundrop that North Carolina has blessed Pepsi the world with. And just so underrated. California and Texas and New York get all the credit. But North Carolina, top 10 in most important best states. Easily. Which is like the top 20%. It's not hard to do. But you get it. Today, 4 stories from the state of North Carolina. We're looking at the lives of John Hall, Robert Harrill, Blanche Taylor Moore, and our first one will be of Peter Stuart Ney.
Story time. Story time. Story time? Story time.
Michel Ney was born in Sarre-Louis, France in 1769. After working as a civil servant for a few years, Ney enlisted in the French army and quickly rose in the ranks before catching the eye of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, I know what you're thinking. John, you said this episode is about North Carolina. Why are we in France? We'll get there. In 1804, Napoleon then made Ney a Marshal of the Empire, which was one of the highest military distinctions in Bonaparte's military force at that time. So, throughout the Napoleonic Wars, Ney earned several nicknames, including Prince de la Moscowa and the Bravest of the Brave. He was wounded at several different battles, but always returned to lead his troops. Well, on April 4th, 1814, Ney became the primary voice for the Marshals' revolt against Napoleon when Ney told Napoleon that the army would not march to Paris. Obviously, Napoleon wasn't happy about that and continued to order his troops to march on to Paris, but Ney stood his ground. In what came to be known as the Bourbon Restoration, the newly crowned King Louis XVIII praised Ney's actions in standing up to Napoleon and gave him a position in the king's army once he pledged allegiance to the crown. Well, when Napoleon returned from exile a year later, Ney then organized a force from the king's troops to stop Napoleon's march on Paris, because Napoleon, he's pretty obsessed with Paris. He's trying to take over the country, and obviously you can't do that unless you take Paris. And Napoleon, he's really trying to do that. However, upon meeting his former leader, Ney decided to rejoin Napoleon's army and was immediately promoted to commander and fought alongside Napoleon during the 100 Days campaign. At Waterloo, however, the famous Battle of Waterloo, Ney's forces failed to break through enemy cavalry units, which ultimately led to Napoleon's defeat. Napoleon was exiled for a second time, and Ney was arrested and tried for treason. On December 10th, 1815, Ney and hundreds of other conspirators against the crown were executed. Now, a month later, a man named Peter Stuart Ney arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, and began bouncing from town to town working as a teacher. Each time, someone would note his resemblance to Michel Ney because Americans were wildly obsessed with Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars going on at that time. And each time, Peter would be like, anytime someone would be like, "Hey, Peter, ain't you Michel Ney?" Because clearly that's how South Carolinians talked in the early 1800s. And then Ney would be like, "Oh no, it is not me. I must leave now." And so he would just pack up and go move to a new town and go back to being a teacher. When Ney actually learned of Napoleon's death in 1821, he reportedly stabbed himself in the neck with a knife. However, the knife broke and he survived his suicide attempt. Ney eventually ended up at Davidson College over near Charlotte, where he worked as a professor and even helped design the seal of the school. So, every college has a seal, a little symbol, emblem, whatever. Well, Peter Stuart Ney designed this. He even challenged and easily defeated a Mocksville fencing instructor in a duel with guns, actually, not in a fencing duel with actual guns. Whenever Ney would get drunk and had a good time, he often spoke in French. He would hint at life in the French army and even shared detailed knowledge of Napoleon's habits that few people would have even never known. He even went through several history books and corrected inaccuracies about Napoleon's conquests and stuff. In 1846, as Ney lay on his deathbed, he was asked by doctors if he was indeed Michel Ney, because at this point, most everyone just really thought that he was. And it wasn't really a huge deal. It's not like he was Napoleon, like Napoleon was exiled and then just magically showed up somewhere. It was like one of his top generals. So granted, it would be like if Goebbels or Goering just showed up in America shortly after World War II ended. That would probably be a little bit more problematic. But it's not like Napoleon was committing genocides and stuff. He was just trying to lead a revolution. And so, Americans were super obsessed with that. A lot of them were probably on Napoleon's side to some degree. And so to believe that one of his top generals, top military commanders just now showed up in North Carolina under a slightly different name, which granted, change your entire name. Don't just change your first name and then also still look like your old identity. You gotta change your entire name and also change up how you look. But this guy didn't do that, apparently. As this story goes, doctors asked this dude, "Hey, are you really Michel Ney?" And as the story goes, Peter Ney lifted himself up and exclaimed that he was indeed, "I am indeed the Michel Ney. What are you going to do about it?" And then he died. His grave is located in the cemetery at Third Creek Presbyterian Church in the town of Cleveland in Rowan County. No one knows how he survived his, quote unquote execution in France. That's kind of a big detail that people really don't kind of show. Some believe that because Ney was actually a Freemason, as were several of the people who oversaw his trial and execution, that they actually staged his specific execution because the Freemasons objected to killing one of their own members. Instead, they whisked him away to America, where he poorly assumed a new identity and lived out the rest of his life. Our next story here is of Blanche Kaiser, who was born in Concord in 1933, but then spent much of her adult life in Alamance County up near Mebane, Graham, kind of between Chapel Hill and Greensboro. Her father was a mill worker, an ordained minister, and an alcoholic, and a known womanizer, who then sold Blanche into prostitution to pay his gambling debts, because that's what Jesus would have done, right? It's crazy. He's an ordained minister who then sells his daughter into prostitution to pay his gambling debt. That's wild. Despite her rough childhood, things turned around for Blanche. She married war veteran James Napoleon Taylor in 1952 and had 2 children with him. She got a job at a Kroger grocery store and was eventually promoted to head cashier, which was the highest position a woman could obtain at Kroger at that time. It's really sad. But that happiness was short-lived. In 1962, Blanche began having an affair with Raymond Reed, the manager of the Kroger where she worked. And then 4 years later, her fantastic father died of what was reported as a heart attack. 5 years after her father's death, her husband also died of a heart attack. So, the death of her husband finally allowed Blanche to go public with her relationship with her store manager, but by 1985, the relationship had run its course. First, she then tried having an affair with a guy named Kevin Denton, who was the regional manager for the Kroger stores in the Midwest. She is sleeping her way to the top, Kamala, and whatever. I'm recording this before the election, so who knows how that statement's going to land. Blanche then, after, banging the regional Kroger manager for a while, she then decided to visit the Carolina United Church of Christ in rural Alamance County on Easter Sunday, where she met Reverend Dwight Moore. She soon began meeting the preacher for dates, despite still having a relationship with her store manager, and embroiled in a lawsuit with Kroger over sexual harassment by Kevin Denton, which she filed shortly after her relationship with Denton ended. So this woman, she's banging her store manager, who she was cheating on her husband with for several years. She then bangs the regional manager, and then when she breaks it off with him, sues the entire company for sexual harassment, and then also starts going to a church and starts banging the preacher there. What? And that's absolutely rooted in some childhood trauma. Are you kidding me? Her dad was a known womanizer and an ordained minister. So she's going to go find another preacher to then cheat on her boyfriend, who she was cheating on her husband with the entire time. Like, so many layers of awfulness already to this story. You already know where it's going. The next year, so 1986, I believe, Reed suddenly developed what was diagnosed as shingles. So this is the preacher. No, I'm sorry. This is her store manager that she's been banging for all these years. Reed developed what was diagnosed as shingles and died a few months later of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is this autoimmune disease that, all the white women on TikTok have now, in which the immune system attacks the peripheral nervous system, causing rapid onset muscle weakness. You lose all the color in your hands. I think that's the same thing. I don't know. Anyway, a year after Reed's death, then the lawsuit with Kroger settled, and Blanche was awarded $275,000. With everyone else dead and now out of the way, she was able to go public with her relationship with Reverend Moore, who had clearly convinced himself that all of these deaths were coincidental, and poor Blanche just had a case of Job's bad luck. Her husband died, her daddy died, her other longtime boyfriend died, and then she got sexually assaulted by the regional manager of Kroger, which ain't even a grocery store that exists in North Carolina anymore, because we got Food Lion, and we got Lowe's Foods, and we got Harris Teeter, and we got Publix, and we got the Piggly Wiggly, and probably another one. Still got some Winn-Dixies around here at the time. Publix not up here yet. That doesn't exist yet. Harris Teeter, I don't think exists yet either. But we got the Piggly Wiggly and the Food Lion for sure. Anyway. Probably got some IGAs, some Carly C's. I think Carly C's is just a Goldsboro thing. Anyway, I'm so far off the rails. The two ended up planning to marry each other in 1987, but then Blanche developed breast cancer. The next year, Reverend Moore developed a serious intestinal illness and needed 2 surgeries before he was actually healthy again. And then by 1989, the two, were fully married, fully healthy. Blanche beats cancer, which great for her. Reverend Moore, he's fully healed. And so the two got married. And then 2 days after they returned from their honeymoon in New Jersey, because when you think honeymoons, you think Jersey. Weird choice. Moore collapsed after eating a chicken sandwich, which is, of all things. After several hospital transfers and meetings with doctors, a toxicology reported that Moore had 20 times the lethal dose of arsenic in his system. However, Moore, with the power of God, he miraculously recovered, though he never actually regained full sensation in his hands and feet because of the arsenic poisoning. As should be expected, having that much arsenic in a body raised some concerns with the doctors, and people began to suspect that Blanche probably poisoned him. No duh. When the State Bureau of Investigation learned of the other deaths in Blanche's life, they ordered exhumations of Blanche's father, her first husband, and of Raymond Reed. Guess what, you guys? All three bodies showed elevated levels of arsenic. Blanche was tried and convicted for the murder of Raymond Reed and was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She was also obviously suspected in the deaths of her father, her first husband, and her former mother-in-law, who also died during this time. They never officially charged her with it, but yeah, obviously she did. Our next story is of Robert Harrill, who was better known as the Fort Fisher Hermit. He spent the first part of his adult life in Shelby, out near the mountains, kind of between, or at the base of the mountains between Charlotte and Asheville. But Robert had a rough life. His mother and two brothers died of typhoid fever when he was young. He was later expelled from a Baptist seminary for being pro-evolution, because God, you can't acknowledge science in the Baptist church. He then worked several jobs, but never really found success because he tended to work alone and was often made fun of by his coworkers. Although Robert got married and had two children, his wife quickly grew tired of his constant bouncing from job to job, as well as his increasing search for finding the meaning of life, which is a sure sign that you've lost your mind. She filed for divorce, actually committed Robert to a mental facility, and then took the kids off to Pennsylvania. While in the hospital, Robert discovered the writings of Dr. William Taylor, who ran a quote-unquote school that focused on biopsychogenetics in Spruce Pine up in the mountains in Mitchell County. And biopsychogenetics, not a real thing. That is a made-up thing for sure. But it all made sense to Robert, and he realized very quickly that he wasn't going to find the meaning of life in some mental institution. So, like any sane person would do, he and a handful of other patients crafted keys from spoon handles and actually escaped out of this facility. Harrill made his way to Spruce Pine, where he continued to study Dr. Taylor's writings, which finally convinced him that he basically just needed to completely start his life over. So, Robert then hitchhiked over 350 miles to Fort Fisher off the coast of North Carolina, out down near Wilmington. There, he found an abandoned ammunition storage building and lived off of oysters that he harvested from the nearby inlet, and he also planted and maintained a small garden near his bunker. When Fort Fisher kind of became a state park and kind of a bigger tourist attraction, he became kind of this beloved addition to the park during the 50s and 60s. He would pose for pictures, and he would kind of preach his quote-unquote common sense beliefs, because if there's anybody who knows anything about common sense, it's a guy that's escaped a mental facility and hitchhiked to the beach. Nearly 20 years after he became the famous Fort Fisher Hermit, Robert Harrill was found dead at the age of 79 in June of 1972 in his bunker by a group of teenagers. They found him naked, covered in sand, and he had several stab wounds. The coroner ruled the cause of death as a heart attack, because you'd have a heart attack too if you were naked and then someone showed up at your door and started stabbing you to death. But he was just a lovable, crazy old man who lived at Fort Fisher for a while. One of the lesser known kind of historical characters in history. Now, our final story is of Dr. John Hall, who practiced dentistry in the small town of Cornelius over in Lake Norman, just north of Charlotte. And so in 2003, at the end of like routine cleanings, the point where the actual dentist comes in, stabs your teeth with the hook, and inspects all the hard work that the dental assistant actually did before he then takes all the credit and the money for it. So Dr. Hall would come in and he would ask the dental assistant to kind of go to the back room and get like some random nondescript tool and bring it back to him. Well, by the time she returned, the appointment would be over and Hall would be like, never mind, I didn't need it after all. And then he would go on to the next exam. So here's what would happen, right? As soon as the assistant left the room, Hall would get up out of his stool, walk over to the cabinet, and pull out a syringe full of like some milky white liquid. He claimed that it was simply just kind of a new kind of cleaning solution to just kind of get the rest of the, the fluoride or the polish or any kind of leftover plaque and tartar out of people's mouths and kind of sterilize a little bit. So he would then squirt some of that into the patient's mouth and ask them to slosh it around their mouth a little bit and then swallow it, which is, you don't swallow anything at the dentist, right? Like every time, you spray the water and you got the sucker in there and then those sounds, that's probably way too much for some of you this early in the morning. But he's like, no, you can just swallow it. Well, Dr. Hall, you guys, surely you can already see where this is going, right? He did not think this entirely through because, for starters, the dental assistant quickly started questioning why she was always being sent away to retrieve a piece of equipment that every time she came back, he never ended up using. Also, has there ever been a cleaning solution, to my earlier point, that was safe to swallow? Even if there was, the one thing you never do at a dentist office is swallow. You absolutely spit everything out, right? So the dental assistant eventually found these empty syringes in the trash and realized that something's probably not right here. So she sent one of the used syringes off to a lab for testing. And when the results came back, the likely horribly mortified dental assistant sent the findings along with testimony from a patient who claimed that she absolutely knew what this cleaning solution was, which is a piece of the story that gets completely overlooked here. They sent this to the police. Here we go. All right. If you are still just completely in the dark as to what was going on here, Hall was eventually convicted of injecting a certain anatomical fluid. For the sake of modesty, we will call splooge, into the mouths of at least 7 different patients. Almost equally as terrible as that, Hall was only sentenced to 4 months in prison for his actions, which was a punishment that he actually chose over the alternative of just serving 5 years of supervised probation because, according to him, the constant monitoring would have been too great a strain on himself and his family because that other thing that he was doing was clearly not that big of a deal. I'm never going to the dentist again.
All done.
You're like, and even beyond the obvious, like that story hits super close to home for me, right? Because I live in Charlotte now, but like for a few years I lived in Mooresville, which is like right up the interstate from Cornelius. I worked in Cornelius for several years, like 4 or 5 years, maybe even more than that, 6. And like, look, I didn't go to the dentist, but if I did, I probably would have gone to a dentist office in Cornelius. And like, sure, this happened in the early 2000s, long before I ever moved out there. But I don't know, man. That's a little too close for comfort for me. So, look, you don't dentist, whatever, just brush your teeth. It's not hard. I get some people like, I swallowed a lot of fluoride when I was a baby. So like my teeth are like pristine. Like they could be brighter. All right. And like probably could have a little bit less plaque, but like I brush my teeth, everything's healthy. I've never had a cavity. Knock on all of the wood that I never have any dental issues whatsoever because I don't want to go through that again. Anyway, that's it. North Carolina Part 2 in the books. Let's recap the other things and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number one of Napoleon's top generals in his army actually had his execution staged by the French crown because everybody was a Freemason, allegedly, and they whisked him away to North Carolina, where he was constantly like, ain't you Michel Ney, one of them there Napoleon soldiers? And he's like, oh, no, you have identified me again. I must move away. And he did. And then he like helped Davidson College like rise up and get established. It's crazy. He allegedly, on his deathbed, he's like, yeah, that is me, I did it. And then whatever. Number two, Robert Harrill, the Fort Fisher hermit, was really just like an escaped mental institution patient. He was always on the search for the meaning of life. Super nice dude. Like, he wasn't like one of those like malicious, crazy people who's like constantly molesting people, but like, and good for the state. Honestly, this is what gets over. Like, good for the state to just let the dude live out his life in his little abandoned ammunitions bunker with his little garden. And then some dickhead stabbed him to death in the 1970s, which is sad. And then number three, don't go to the dentist. All right. Just don't. Like, that's gross. They just squirting jizz in mouths of patients. That's crazy and shouldn't be happening. But it did in the greater Charlotte area.
What did we learn?
Next week on Our Weird World, we are getting mysterious once again and pissing off all you people who really need closure in your stories. We have three more mysterious murderers. Next week, we're looking at the Phantom Killer, the New Orleans Axeman, and the Alphabet Murders. Who done them? We don't know. That's why they're mysterious. And that's why they're got nicknames instead of actual people names. You get it. That's it. Thanks for listening. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.
This is a podcast